Good evening. On behalf of UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, I'd like to welcome those of you in the room as well as those watching via live stream to this evening's Discover Alaska lecture. My name is Brenda Dow, and I'm part of an organization for educators called Delta Kappa Gamma. Members of our organization will be introducing the Discover Alaska speakers each week. So at UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Trothyeta campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Diné people of the lower Tanana River. This year's Discover Alaska lectures are presented by UAF College of Indigenous Studies faculty members. Tonight we will hear from Charlene Stern, Vice Chancellor for Rural, Community, and Native Ed, who will discuss a changing landscape, community development in Alaska. Born and raised in interior Alaska, Dr. Charlene Stern is originally from Arctic Village and an enrolled member of the Native Village Avinatai tribal government. She holds a bachelor's degree in American Cultural Studies from Western Washington University, a master's degree in Community and Regional Planning from the University of New Mexico, and a doctorate in Indigenous Studies from UAF. Dr. Stern was named Interim Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor of UAF in May 2025 after serving as Vice Chancellor for Rural, Community, and Native Education since December 2021. Prior to that appointment, Dr. Stern taught as faculty in UAF's Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, receiving tenure and promotion to the rank of Associate Professor in 2021. Please welcome Dr. Stern.
All right, well, Masit Cho, Shojik Charlene Sternoji, Vashraik O Gwatsan Ihli Ga Tanan Gwichi. As mentioned, my name is Charlene Stern. I come from a family from Arctic Village, and my dad's family is from the Bay Area. In our culture, it is customary to introduce ourselves in a traditional manner, which tells the audience that you're talking to who you are, where you come from, and who you're descended from and who you're related to. So it's a much longer introduction. But it's our way of making connections between your family, the place you're from, and how that has collectively shaped who you are and what you then have to say. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm very happy for the College of Indigenous Studies to be partnering with the Discover Alaska lecture series. And so we'll go ahead and get started. The title of my presentation is A Changing Landscape in Community Development in Alaska, which was really inspired by a couple of things. One, my experience growing up here between Fairbanks and my community of Arctic Village, also known as Vashraik O in our language. And then my educational background and my professional career as a community planner prior to coming to the university, and really my graduate research that was done both at the University of New Mexico and then continued here in my doctoral program at UAF. So I'm really happy that, we'll go ahead to the next slide. I'm really happy that the land acknowledgement was included in the introduction. Thank you. We at UAF really try to make it a practice to include land acknowledgements, and for more people, whether they're native or non-native, to get into the practice of feeling comfortable using them. The way I was raised with land acknowledgements, it's a practice that we as Indigenous people use when we visit one another's traditional territory, and it recognizes that I know I'm a guest on your lands. I know that, you know, for centuries or millennia, your people have stewarded these lands to allow them to be at the state of health that they are today. And it's that acknowledgement that we see you, I see you, and I know that that relationship that your people have had continues to this day. And so to us, it's really important to do that land acknowledgement. It is a formality, I think, to some, but for us, there's some pretty deep meaning behind it. So thank you for adding that. Next slide. So just to talk a little bit more about where I come from. So I mentioned that I come from a place called Vashrike-O, and Vashrike-O in the Gwich'in language means a creek along a steep bank. And it's interesting because Indigenous peoples, wherever they are or wherever they are from, are people of place. And that nurturing of your spirit through place, whether it's the land, the water, the air, the animals, it has this deep like genetic imprint on you. And it's often true even if you aren't physically raised in that space. There's something that ties you to this, this place that your ancestors are from. And so for me, that's Vashrike-O. This is a photo of Vashrike-O that is taken kind of between, what is now the current contemporary community, but it shows this fishing spot. And that's really why Vashrike-O was settled at this particular place, because over the majority of our history, this was known as an occasional fishing spot for our people. It wasn't until the early 1900s that there was actually structures built in Vashrike-O. And so you can imagine for how many generations and centuries our people inhabited a much larger landscape than just this one place. And it wasn't even really up until the 1960s and 70s that you start to see a density of housing and a more permanent year-round occupation of Arctic Village. Our people lived a very migratory, traditional lifestyle. They would fish here during certain times of the year, but they were in the mountains during other times of the year, all over this country. And, to some degree, we still practice some of that movement today. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. When I was a graduate student looking for a community planning program, I really wasn't sure what I was going to find out there. If you look at a lot of the community development and planning programs across the country, a lot of them focus on urban environments. They really focus on community planning or development as kind of a product, but it really is both a product and a process, and you can't really have one without the other. And so, when I started applying to programs, I was really thinking I'm going to learn a lot about land uses and how to manage different communities and how they use land and, housing, transportation, all of those things. But it wasn't until I came across my program at the University of New Mexico, which had a very strong Indigenous planning component, that I started to think about planning in a very different way. Most of the programs in the country, including to some extent ours, really focused on and taught that the history of community planning and development emerged in the early 1900s as part of the rise of city building in America. Urban centers were getting populated. There were issues of housing density, zoning, all these kinds of issues that were relatively new to America. And so you learn some of that, but thankfully in our program, we learned that was just kind of one version of that history and that theory. And what's started to set in through that program is that planning is essentially and fundamentally a human activity, and that every society that's ever existed anywhere uses planning and community building to bring people together and achieve ultimately some of the things that they want for themselves and their children. One of the things that I became really interested in is how Alaska Native people utilize planning. How do they utilize it today? How do they utilize it, traditionally? And what is the similarities and differences in contemporary planning versus more traditional planning? So I did a lot of my graduate work focusing on my community. I spent a lot of time interviewing elders, trying to better understand some of the Gwich'in planning concepts and how people, what they were thinking about when they would move from place to place, when they would have to make decisions about uprooting their families in 50 below zero. I mean, when survival is so precarious, you have to rely on things that practices that you were taught, all of this kind of deep traditional knowledge to be able to inform what your next move is, because it could be a disastrous one if you make the wrong decision. And certainly that happened from time to time. We have our share of tragic stories like that. But if you think about it, the fact that people still exist in the North and have for as long as they have means that they probably have a pretty good sense of how to plan effectively in the environments that they live in. So one of the things that I sort of learned as I talked with elders about our traditional planning practices, and I would say, even though this is really focused on my region and the Gwich'in, that there are some common themes that probably carry through many other Indigenous cultures across the state and beyond. One of the things is that we planned according to seasons, which I don't think will come as a surprise to a lot of people. When we were living in winter, we were already often preparing for spring. When we were in the midst of spring, we were preparing for summer. And I know this by talking to elders about how they prepared and preserved food, about what the activities were that they were focused on at any given time. They were always thinking kind of one step ahead, which in a way impresses me, because you think about, in the middle of winter, just how much mental, physical, emotional bandwidth is taken up just from having to survive from day to day, but also thinking about, okay, where am I going to be? What does my family need in the next season? And again, elders talked about how we had to have that foresight. So when we talk about our traditional planning, it was not only from day to day, but really from season to season, but also, much longer kind of foresight, which is generation to generation. The decisions that elders made at any given time, or leaders of our communities, always thought about what is going to be the impact later down the road. And it's interesting, they talk about even in the month of June and July, they wouldn't be harvesting birds because they knew that birds were having their young, and they knew that any one of those mature birds that they took would have an impact on the harvest later on. And so they purposely restricted their practices at their own expense to make sure that those resources were going to be available later on. And they did that with other subsistence harvests too. They knew when perhaps they took their share of the caribou for that season, then they would move to a different subsistence resource. And so they were always just thinking one step ahead, which I think is something that actually endures today, despite some of the influences that cause us to plan a lot more short term. You can move to the next slide. So this is just a basic conceptual model that I've used a lot over the years as I've taught classes in community development. And it's this concept that part of what I think worked so powerfully for Indigenous communities traditionally in their own development practices is that they exercised higher degrees of control and influence over the things that mattered most in their lives. And if you think about it, it really makes sense from even a personal level. Personally, if you have more influence over the things that really matter to you, then the chances are you'll have some ability to better shape the outcomes of those things. The more that those spheres are kind of constricted or eroded, the more difficult it is for you to impact positive outcomes in those areas. The effort that it takes often, the strategies that it takes to impact those things just gets more and more multiplied the further out of these two spheres you go. So when you take it back to this model, I think about, traditionally our communities, we exercised high degrees of control over our governance. Our traditional governance structure is very much matched the needs of our communities and our people at any given time. The tribal governments today that you see and that most are more familiar with are often not representative of our traditional governance systems. There might be elements of that, but the structure and the purpose and the mission are all pretty different. We used to be a lot more mobile, and that has impacts too when you think about just, the some of the challenges that settled communities have today with needing to keep up with infrastructure, with not being able to move once resources in that immediate area are depleted or diminished. You're kind of sort of stuck in this general area, and so mobility is constricted. We used to have a lot more spheres of control over our resource use, what resources were used, how much they were used, what those socially acceptable practices were, whether it was subsistence, whether it was wood, water, all of that. We used to exercise a lot more communal and local control over some of that. We were in charge of our own education and training programs. Whatever we felt like the younger generations needed to know was the information that was passed down and practiced and fine-tuned, because those were the skills that our people needed to be able to survive in our communities. So those were things that were, I think, of pretty high value that our people had a whole lot of ability to influence or to control back in more historic times. The things that were, I think, more in that outer sphere of influence were things like illnesses. Our people, of course, through various pandemics, had to deal with exposure to all kinds of diseases. And while we didn't have an ability necessarily to control that, there were times where we were able to intervene with our own medicines, and or we would move away from centers of disease, things, adaptive strategies that we can use to kind of mitigate some of that influence. We were able to control trade relationships or to influence trade relationships. So, my community had a lot of traditional enemies that we didn't always get along, but there were advantages to trading. And so whether we initiated it or others, communities initiated it, we had the ability to sort of participate and dictate some of that relationship. And then just general resource availability. When you're able to move from place to place, the chances that you're depleting any one area are lower. And so again, just being able to kind of have some of that that flexibility really mattered for our communities and the overall practices of sustainability that came with them. And then, of course, there were things that were completely outside of our control and influence, whether it was the weather or the climate or natural disasters. But even in those cases, we often had adaptive strategies that prevented us from being in situations like today where there's massive flooding events and our communities are really at the mercy of some of that. We'll go to the next slide. So these spheres changed quite a bit over time. When you think about Alaska and just all of the forces of change that have occurred in our state. And it's really interesting because, people often homogenize Alaska Native people and their experience, but it really is pretty diverse and varied. Whether, you were on the Aleutians and some of the first contact was with Russian settlements, or whether you were all the way up where I'm from and the first contact was with fur traders. The experience of all of that was very different, and the intent, I think, of that first contact and how that shaped relations with Indigenous peoples really is pretty diverse. So over time, of course, there were many, many forces of change. And I often think about these as like waves that are sort of hitting Indigenous communities over time. And, one of them was the military and military contact. In our region, Fort Yukon became a military outpost. And interestingly, our people were impacted by the military in so many different ways, including through research. Many years ago in the 1950s, the Air Force did a study, which some people might be familiar with, which essentially was intended to research why Alaska Native people were so able to adapt to cold climates. And they had this theory that they could administer radioactive iodine in the thyroids of Indigenous people and measure the uptake. And then they did a sample population of non-natives in the military soldiers, and were comparing the data. And they did this in my community, in Fort Yukon, in Ukqiavik, and several others. And the interesting thing about this project was it wasn't discovered widely until a few decades ago. And it wasn't until a journalist actually came across the file that this project became known, and our tribes actually sued on behalf of the federal government. My mom was a minor. At the time of the study, she was one of the recipients of the iodine. Her parents, her brother, they all received radioactive samples into their body without actually knowing what it was, because they didn't speak English. And they actually thought that the military who showed up in lab coats were doctors and that they were being treated for something or the other. And so, it's interesting. Each community, each family has these stories to tell that are very personal. So when we talk about kind of, military impact on Alaska and on rural communities, it's at kind of a broad level, but also at a very personal and family level as well. There's also the influence of Christianity, which I won't go into the whole history about that. I think probably others that have done this lecture series have, but essentially the state at one point was carved up into different regions, and different denominations were given sort of full authority to move into those areas and to establish churches. And so that's why you'll see, like in interior Alaska, the vast majority of rural communities tend to be Catholic, versus where I'm from, they tend to be Episcopalian. And it's because the state was basically carved up, and Christian institutions or religious institutions were given the ability to kind of lay claim in some of those areas. And then, of course, resource developments over time, whether it was the gold rush or whether it was the discovery of oil and gas on the North Slope of Alaska. I mean, each one of those has had impacts on our communities. And really, all of these things, both kind of separate, but then together, have really shaped our experience over the last 150 to 200 years. And I think about the timeline of this a lot, because when you think about the experience of Indigenous peoples in the lower 48, you're often talking about first contact being several hundred years ago. But in the state of Alaska, that was like in my great-grandfather's time. It's not that far back. My own mother was actually born about 20 miles outside of Vashreko in a canvas tent at 50 to 70 below zero in the middle of December. And to think about, she'll be 87 this year, all of the change that she's seen in her lifetime is pretty massive. And so I think about that a lot, because I feel like this process of the change that we're going through and that we've internalized over time has been so rapid, and more rapid than I think we actually give it credit for. It feels like in some ways it's still settling in. We can go to the next slide. So there are a lot of different ways that the forces of change have embedded themselves within our society today, and some of the dramatic transformations, I guess, that they have created. And I'm just going to kind of highlight a few of them here. One of them is what I alluded to in the beginning. Very few, if any, Alaska Native populations existed in permanent year-round settlements. Most of them, had some aspect of their life that was more migratory, although, some of the communities, like on the coast and stuff, might be different because they had more stable sources of food in oceans and that type of thing. But the story of each community and how they became settled is really unique and interesting, and has repercussions for today. One of the communities in my region, Chalkitsik, has a pretty common story where they would live up and down traditionally the Black River. And when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came and was building schools, the barge at that time of year could only get up so far. And so where the community had preferred the settlement to be is nowhere near where it actually is, because that was as far as the barge could get up the river with all of that material. And hence why so many communities now are in pretty bad locations. They aren't the locations that they would have chosen perhaps on higher ground. And of course, with climate change, it's kind of accelerated some of the erosion, in-river erosion that we're seeing across the state. But this has really big repercussions because if you think about now, okay, the bones of settlement have been laid, and community and families had to choose then to live in a year-round settlement for their kids to be able to go to school. You kind of have no choice but to then just start building on the land that you have, and that has really led to some pretty expensive infrastructure projects, infrastructure failures, all these sorts of things that our communities are dealing with now. Interestingly, in our case in Vashaiko, we chose that place of settlement. Our settlement was not based on a BIA decision. We chose it, and we settled it over a much broader period of time. Doesn't mean it's not without its challenges, but it ended up being pretty good ground for our community. Also, with some of the forces of change, there have been a lot of systemic attempts to oppress our culture, our heritage, our languages, whether it was the outlawing of potlatches or the abuse of children in boarding schools for speaking their native languages. There is no shortage of examples of cultural oppression, and what that does to a people over time is pretty astounding, actually. And so, here I just want to say at the UAF campus, and part of the premise of the College of Indigenous Studies is to give folks an opportunity to reclaim some of that. We have some pretty profound programs that instead of having to choose between education and culture, or education and heritage, or education and language, which many of our parents and grandparents had to do, you can come here to get an education, at the same time reinforce your identity, and have access to some of that heritage that you might not have had before. So that's something that we're very proud of. This introduction of mixed economies, I'm kind of speaking in generalities. Each one of these is its own discussion, but for the most part, our communities really were trade economies. We didn't need cash for transactions. That was what our whole bartering system was based on. But today, the complexity of having a subsistence economy next to a cash economy is very real, and it's so interesting to me to see how that plays out now, because somebody was just telling me that they were visiting one of their village stores, and there was literally only a couple things on the shelf because food is getting more and more expensive to import in. At the same time, communities are really struggling to access their traditional foods in some areas, or even if they do have moose or some resource to harvest, they're having to go further and further out, which is costing them more and more money. And so if you don't have the cash to be able to pay for the gas that's required, then your food insecurity is just doubled down even more. So these are real issues when we think about what are the opportunities for folks that live in rural communities to actually generate enough of a wage or an income to offset some of the subsistence activities that they need to do or want to do. One of the things that I'll talk about here and provide some examples of in a little bit is this notion of fractured land ownership. So one of the things I didn't mention in the land acknowledgements is that almost any place that you will ever find yourself across the world is somebody's ancestral land. And nowadays, it's really hard to know whose land are you actually on, and who owns that land now, and who has access, and all of those complications that have come as a result of some of the fractured land ownership practices. I mentioned restricted access to subsistence resources. This comes in all kinds of forms, whether it is from policy, from practice, from resource scarcity, to population declines. I mean, we're seeing what's happening with the king salmon on the Yukon. People aren't practicing the same level of access to the subsistence resources that our forefathers did, or even our mothers did, or even we did maybe 10 to 20 years ago. And that of all these things, I think, hits at the heart the most. because our people have a relationship with those resources in ways that are really, really hard to describe. It's not just about food, it's about who we are and our culture. One of the things that I often think about too is just the various layered forms of government that we're seeing now in this changed context. Before I mentioned our communities were governed by traditional governance structures. And today, we not only will have a tribal government, but we'll have often city government, we'll have a borough government, and then there's all these other institutions, whether it's education system or whether it's Alaska Native corporations or what have you. There's kind of this layered system of institutions now that really impact our communities and what we do and what we can't do, and it's gotten a lot more messy to some degree. I mentioned contested tribal sovereignty. It's interesting because Alaska has 229 federally recognized tribes, which is more than any other state in the nation. It's roughly about 40% of all federally recognized tribes nationally. Yet we didn't get formally recognized until the 90s when Ada Deer added us to the federal list of tribes. And even with that federal recognition, it has been challenging to get the same recognition within our own state. And that's very much still playing out. You're seeing, I think, today all kinds of legal contests over various forms of tribal sovereignty, whether it has to do with the new gaming enterprise that Eklutna is doing to land into trust. There's a million ways that our contested tribal sovereignty is playing out today. And then the other thing, which I think is true for rural communities especially, but also Alaska in general, is our very high dependency on external funding. And we're seeing some of the pain points of that dependency today with some of the reductions that are being discussed with federal funding and our shortage of ability here in the state to be able to compensate for some of that loss. And the more rural the community, the higher that dependency and the costs, and that's very much a challenge for our people and our communities. We can move to the next slide. So one of the examples that I want to show just in terms of the complexity of lands is this nice graphic that was done by Alaska Department of Natural Resources. And, I know you probably can't see all of the detail here, but this pie chart up at the top is really something that I look at. And essentially it shows that, when you look at what was once a homeland of all of the indigenous peoples in some form or fashion, now, being within 12% of private ownership in the state, 24% state of Alaska, and 63% U.S. government. It's really incredible to think about. And of course, the U.S. government is shown in according to federal agency and not as a block. If you were to see it as a block, I think it would be even more striking. But this is divided up between DOD and U.S. Forest Service and NPS and all of the various federal landowners. But when we think about the impact of federal decisions on Alaska, so much of it has to do with land. And so that, just thinking about then each community and what their development story is and what their options are as it relates to who their neighbors are is really interesting. And if we move to the next slide, I'll show you an example of that. So this is a black and white, of course. You won't be able to see the color like in the previous one, but this is a zoomed in version of Fort Yukon, which is known in the Gwich'in language as Gwich'ajeh. This is kind of a zoomed in map of their current community. And you can see even within a relatively small footprint geographically, there's so much mixed land ownership that it's really mind-boggling in a way. So you have, in some cases, land that's owned by the tribe, which is very unusual in the state. You don't see very many tribes in Alaska actually owning land, and if they do, it's often smaller parcels that they've acquired through various means. And then you see Doyon Lands, which is our regional for-profit corporation in Interior with the stripes. And then you see in the darker gray blocks, the Village Corporation lands. And then in the really dark blocks, the kind of ones that are in smaller increments, those are native allotments, which is also its own topic that probably somebody talked about. But our communities were afforded the ability to set aside individual native allotments many years ago as part of the Dawes Act application to Alaska. And it's interesting when I look at, Fort Yukon's land selections, because they all are kind of closer to the center of town. There's some that are out in the broader community. But when you look at, say, Arctic villages, the first place that our people chose to claim allotments are around one of our sacred lakes, because that lake is in the northern part of our territory. My tribe actually owns 1.8 million acres of our traditional lands, but our border stops right where that lake is. And so strategically, when we were given the opportunity to do land selections, our people got together and said, we need to protect the waterfront of this lake. And so that's where a lot of them chose their allotments. And then secondary to that, they chose them in their customary and family use areas, much of which is beyond the outskirts of the village. So every community is a little bit different, but the reason I bring this up is because you can imagine when a tribe, for example, has a community development project, but they don't own land. How do they make decisions? How do they get funding for it? How do they kind of demonstrate that they are in a position to execute on a project if they don't even have site control over that land? This came up in my work. I was a rural planner for many years, working across the state, and this was always the challenge for tribal governments. They are often the ones that are in a position to get federal funding, but they don't have land rights. And so they would always have to work some kind of legal agreement with the city or with a native corporation to execute like a long-term lease. And that just added more time and more complexity to these transactions. And so, thinking about how do you plan a cohesive community in the most affordable way you possibly can when you can't even guarantee that you'll get easement rights through the areas that you need to run utilities. I mean, it's a really challenging situation, and oftentimes the funding that they're using has got a time constraint on it, and any one of these complex situations can really delay out a project. And so, when we think about some of the challenges that our communities are facing today in this changed landscape, this is a big one. This is a really big one. You can move to the next slide. So as a student of a planning program, one of the things I realized pretty early is that all of the theory in the world and all of the book knowledge that we were tested on really doesn't prepare you for actually doing community development in practice, and especially in a context like Alaska that is so different from many other contexts in the lower 48. And so having that applied experience in the field is something that you often just get through experience. Programs that we have here at UAF, like the Rural Development Program, are really geared to making the connection between the theory and the practice of community development. Because if you don't connect them, then you sort of put yourself and your communities you work with at risk of really supporting a status quo that ends up producing the same outcomes. And for many communities, marginalized communities, those same outcomes equate to the same inequities, the same inequalities, and often poor results. And so this quote comes from a book called Community in Action, and it says, "Community development has for many years suffered from a dislocation of its theory from its practice. This results in not only us making it up as we go along, but we put ourselves in danger of acting to support a status quo that continues to churn out the same inequalities with the same results." And I think like any discipline that you learn in a university setting, once you learn the information and the practice and the history and all of it, it's really up to you how much of that you reflect on and put into practice in your daily work. And which of those things do you then push back on and challenge, because that's just maybe the right thing to do. For community development, this is especially important. You move to the next slide. One of the classic problems with most community development models today and over time has been their fascination and hyper-focus on needs-based approaches. So, oftentimes communities, and especially when you're working with marginalized communities, it's tempting as a practitioner to go in and kind of like diagnose what the problems of that community are. And to think that if only this community had this resource or this funding, that we'd be able to solve these problems. And for a long time, that was kind of what was taught, is there must be something inherently or fundamentally wrong with these communities that results in the problems that they're facing, whether it's behavioral or whether it's educational, or there's any number of things. And so the first step that they teach you is go in, do a needs assessment, and then kind of think about what resources would be needed to be able to bring to the community that would help them to address some of these issues. And that framing is super problematic because the communities themselves feel like they don't have a lot of ownership over that, and that the knowledge and solutions and the talents that they have as a community have no room really in solution building, because if they were of value, those problems may not exist to the extent that they do. And so this mentality is still pretty prevalent. It's I think the more challenging thing than somebody coming in with this mentality is that over time, if enough people come in and have that understanding and that belief, the people in those communities start to believe it themselves. It's the form of internalizing this interpretation of them, and it actually then reduces their agency and their empowered mindset to be able to contribute to some of these solutions in the long term. One of the things I just will highlight is that there's an implicit assumption in this kind of a framework that the responsibility to act depends on outsiders to come in and do something, which is really challenging position to be in. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is kind of how this plays out in communities. I've seen this over many years, and worked with communities that, as I mentioned, have kind of internalized this version of community building or development. It often starts with a recognition that we have a problem, and then the next kind of realization is we need someone or something or some agency to do something about that. Who is it that can help us? Do we need funding? What grants are out there become kind of like the logical sequence of questions. Strategies then often become dictated immediately by funding because, everybody knows funding is scarce. And so then you just immediately start thinking about, okay, what's out there? What do we need to bring in? What are the hoops we have to jump through to do that? And then all of that kind of shapes the implementation of strategies. And really, if you're lucky, you might see some good positive results out of a process like that, but chances are the solutions tend to be pretty Band-Aid and short-term. So they might work for a while, or they might impact a few things positively, but in the end, those issues will still be there because there's deeper roots than what any of those solutions can really impact. If you move to the next slide, an overlay over a process like this is kind of how the politics of community development as they are today then interact with that needs-based mindset. Essentially, if you go into a community and you initiate a community development process, you will always start with an expression of local concerns. These are the things that matter to me. These are the things that I'm concerned about. These are, whatever it is. And then at some point, that broad funnel perspective starts to get whittled down by all these considerations that really, are often external considerations, but that are the keys to, kind of solving some of these real world challenges. And before you know it, those things really start to dictate strategies to respond to those concerns. And often what you're left with is like a tangible deliverable, a project, a program, an initiative that we think is going to be our saving grace, that is somehow going to do something so impactful that it's going to tie back to the concerns that we had in the first place. And, I think that sometimes that's true and sometimes that's needed. But if we kind of lose sight of the goal in mind, which is to try to develop as creative as solutions to some of the local challenges that we have outside of all of these external factors, then you're really letting those things dictate your strategy, and that's not a great place to be. If we move to the next slide. So the alternative to this sort of needs-based, deficiency-based framework is something called asset-based community development, and it's largely what we teach here in our rural development programs. Before I jump into that real quick, I just wanted to impart a quote that I heard once from Graham Smith, who is the husband of Linda Smith, very well-known scholars in Aotearoa Maori country. And one of the things that he always says is a way to earn respect is to show you the blisters on your hands, or to show whoever the blisters on your hands. And to me, that really shows literally that you have skin in the game, that that your skills as a community development practitioner are put in service to people and to community in a real way. So if we move to the next slide, a lot of people define the goal of community development in lots of different ways. As I mentioned, some people think of it as the process itself. Some people think of it as the outcomes. One of the things I've always believed, and again, the quote that you're seeing up here comes from Margaret Ledwith's book, is it's really about people. It's about empowering people. And that often actually means rethinking your role in the process. You become more of an agent, a facilitator, somebody that works alongside community, and sometimes is the one that challenges their own internal limitations of what they think is possible and their strengths to contribute to that. So this quote is, "The challenge of community development is to create conditions for people to be confident and autonomous, able to act together to bring about change. As a practitioner, the first step in the process of change, therefore, is to fully believe in people's capacity to be thinking and conscious, capable of acting together to change their lives and to change the world. Without this belief, it is impossible to work with the concept of empowerment." And I think for those of us that teach here at the university and are really preparing the next generation of whoever, whatever discipline we're in, this applies because I think there's something here that challenges you to not just sort of say that you believe that people are really conscious and capable of envisioning their lives and working towards good change, but it's really exercising that belief and putting it into practice. If we move to the next slide. So this is just a flow chart that kind of shows what the difference is if you take an asset-based approach to community development. Instead of focusing on the deficiencies or the needs right off the bat, you're really focusing on the existing strengths. And when you do that, you're your lens is less external and more internal. And so you start to ask questions about, what are the assets in this community? What are the things that we have going for us that are going well? And, resources that we can put to work in service of solving some of our challenges. That doesn't mean that external resources aren't going to be helpful to that end, but it really is the sense that we have trust in ourselves and want to be an active partner in developing solutions that are going to work for us. And really, because it's people that are developing it for the communities they care most about, those strategies tend to be more long-term in nature, and they tend to be more sustainable. And so this mindset really encourages self-reliance and community problem solving. But I think the thing that makes it so different than the previous one is that the responsibility to act rests with the community, and it doesn't depend on anyone to come in and to save the community in any way. So we can move to the next slide. This shows what that type of mentality leads to or looks like in action. Instead of starting from a place of, okay, we have a problem, it's really that we believe better outcomes are possible, that we believe that we are deserving and our future generations are deserving of better outcomes than we're seeing today. And that people are really invested in conversations then about discussing what it is that we want. I think when marginalized communities have been marginalized for so long, it's really hard to even dream or envision, because you're just literally trying to deal with what's on your plate that day or whatever crisis is going on at that time. But it is really important to know what is this community aspiring to in the long term, because the strategies have to connect to that. And then again, the first emphasis is kind of what strengths, assets do we have internally? And then instead of asking, who needs to come in with what resources and looking outward, it's a different framing to say, what are the current resource gaps? What are the things that maybe don't exist or don't exist to the extent that we need them within the community that would be helpful to us as we strategize? And then how do we actually partner with others to meet those resource gaps? So you actually see yourself in this kind of a scenario as a partner instead of the recipient of somebody's generosity. And that also is an empowering framework to have. And then I think the other piece of this type of approach is that you sort of work with what you have at the time, knowing that this isn't probably still going to be your Hail Mary, that there will be some good things that come out of it. But if you don't see the results, you're kind of doing a formative evaluation the entire time. So as you're employing strategies, there's probably going to be strategy adjustment, and you know that on the front end, and you're not devastated when something isn't working out and feeling like it's a total failure. You just assess what needs to be shifted and just keep going. So the last slide I have is just, and you can move to the next slide, is this set of questions that I think is really important for communities to think about as they determine kind of where are they at in their development journey today within this, changed landscape. And really seeing this kind of spectrum of externally controlled development versus more self-determined development. Where are they at any given time, and where do they want to be? And if you decide that you want to be on more of one end of the spectrum than the other, asking these set of reflective questions: whose future are we talking about? Who gets to decide that future and what it could look like? Who's doing the analysis and making the decisions? Who has the authority, the control, and the final decision-making power? Whose values, ethics, concepts, and knowledge are we employing? All of these questions just help, I think, to give people a framework to assess where they're at. And I would venture to say that most rural communities in Alaska and urban communities, have really been put in a position of being, their development being more externally controlled. And if we ever want to move to a place where that decision making is more local and more self-determined, then we're going to have to reflect on these questions and move the dial and think about the various aspects of our lives that are that matter the most, and try to exercise the highest degrees of control and influence over those things, and to impact those outcomes as much as we possibly can. So with that, I'd like to just thank Summer Sessions for the opportunity to present, and I will leave it there. Masicho.